Let's talk about 2020, because I think we got fooled, and I think we're still being fooled in many different areas. So we are dealing, I think, as we enter 2021, spring and then the prediction season, there's this dangerous confluence of factors out there. It could victimize you, especially if you wager on college football, or especially if you make very bold proclamations. You know, if you're the first to talk and the last one to shut up at the water cooler, this could really victimize you. The confluence of events, they are as follows. Number one, we're in kind of a snap judgment culture to begin with, football and otherwise. So it doesn't seem to me like people really sit back and prop one of their legs up, put their hands on the back of their head, and just take a healthy inventory of the landscape. Everyone's got to react just like that. You got to have a take just like that. We don't always do it on this show, but by and large, I mean, think about what I'm talking about. Everyone knows what they think as soon as they see something. And second, we just had a season that was disproportionately impacted program to program by COVID. And it's been this very broad, generalized 50,000-foot take that you've heard out there 100 times at this point that, well, everyone had to deal with it. That's true. But this was not a thunderstorm that two teams played in where they truly were proportionately impacted. If you had 17 kids get sick and I had 38 get sick, if you had no coaches get sick and I had 7 of them get sick, we were disproportionately impacted. And so over the course of 6 games or 8 games or 12 games, however many we played, our results could have been disproportionately reflective of how much we weren't impacted by COVID. So think about all those things coming together, because all you have to go on in 2020 is what your eyeballs saw, right? So you saw some programs woefully underachieve. You saw one of them overachieve. I'm about to talk about all of them in a second, but I'm not telling you, nor am I telling myself, ignore 2020. What I'm simply saying is we need to take it into its proper context and we need to properly weigh it. So let's talk about Penn State first off, because this one by 100 miles is the one that my eyeballs and attention eventually go to. 11-3, let me just read you their final 4 records up until this past year. 11-3, 11-2, 9-4, 11-2, and then they go 4-5. Have you thought recently, until we just started talking about them now, have you thought recently about the prior 4 years at Penn State? When I ask you your opinion on James Franklin, Penn State, have those last 4 years entered into the equation in the last couple of weeks, or has your mind gone right back to this past year? Because this past year was a disaster by pretty much every metric. In fact, I didn't think that they would win 4 games at one point. And so do you even remember the prior 4 years? And I'm asking you this. What is the real Penn State? Who is the real James Franklin? Is it the guy who was going 11, 11, 9, 11 wins, or is it the 4-5 guy? And I would just humbly suggest to you, we may need to lean a little bit more towards averaging double-digit wins over the past 4 years, being in contention for the Big Ten championship more often than not, than 4-5. They had a new offensive coordinator last year at the worst possible time. As it turns out, no one was set up to install a new offense or a new defense, and have any kind of result that was on par with what people expected. Let's put it that way. Their best player, Micah Parsons, opts out with all the COVID stuff that was happening. They then lost their top 2 running backs. That was going to end up being the focal point of their offense. And so they lost one of the most important mechanisms, 2 of them actually, that were going to be instrumental in their offensive success. And then they had a bunch of internal stuff going on too. I know that you don't really care about hearing about people's family problems and about, James Franklin having to send his family to Florida to get out of that mess. It was a reality. And it's not an excuse, because he's not sitting here. I'm making it for him, so I can make excuses. But here's what I'm asking. I'm asking, is it wise, if we had to put money on the line and guess what, or predict and bet on what Penn State's going to be 2021 and beyond, is it really wise to let that be our default? Because that's not going to be, I'm just telling you ahead of time, that's not going to be my default for Penn State. So love the hire of Mike Yurcich, but then again, I thought I loved the hire of Kirk Ciarrocca at offense coordinator. So remains to be seen, just the old ellipsis, ... on that. But James Franklin, Tennessee came after him hard. And I'm not saying that it should be a great big pat on the back or anything that he chose to stick it out with his current contract. They pay him a ton of money, but at the very least, you understand the reinvigorated nature. You have now confirmed that he wasn't looking for a way to get out of there. So all those really back of your mind sort of worries, those should be alleviated. And they got a really good roster. I mean, you could argue they got one of the best rosters that they've had up there under him. So I expect Penn State to bounce back immediately this year. I think 2020 will be a blip on the radar screen. Now, LSU, out of all the decks of cards, with all these teams, this is one with the most wild cards in it. I don't know how many are supposed to be in there, but they got like 15 or 20. 2020 was impossible for them. As it turns out, we didn't know it at the time. We had our suspicions. But as it turns out, when you take into account everything that was kind of thrown into the pot and stirred together, 2020 was going to be impossible for them. So on top of the COVID situation, you throw in making some bad hires. One incredibly bad hire defensively, and then touting that bad hire did Ed Orgeron in the middle of camp. Off-field issues, and this was a little bit different than the Penn State off-field variety. They lost like 30 to 35, somewhere in that neighborhood. They lost that many players off of what had been the 2019 team, which is just a spectacularly incredible number. Shay Dixon over on Go247.com just had this running tally of here's the list of guys that were on last year's team that aren't going to be on this year's team. Now, they had a bunch of them drafted, but that wasn't even half. The guys who left for graduation or draft, it ended up not even being half of the total amount of players. So they had an entirely new roster. Forget the term team. They had an entirely new roster. Then on top of that, keep in mind, of course, you're replacing your OC and your DC. You are replacing a generational Heisman winning quarterback. And also, I mean, they had the general complacency concern that any national champion has. And so who in the world was going to handle that? Ed Orgeron didn't handle it. I don't know if the best in the game would have handled it. Like, I would love to have seen the best coaches in America be given that set of circumstances. You could argue back, well, the best coaches in America in some cases would not have allowed their team to be caught in those circumstances. I get what you're saying there. So I'm going to put that point to the side for a second. Here are the questions. This is what's going to determine things with LSU. Number one, ultimately, is Ed Orgeron the right guy here? I think this is a really loaded question. And number two, and this is non-football really, this is just the off-the-field stuff in general. I mean, investigations are going on right now that none of us are equipped to have any kind of inside information on. And so that's ultimately going to be the answer. There are a lot more than just, can they bounce back on the field? How about Wisconsin? Now, this one's kind of off the radar. Like Penn State, LSU, those are well publicized. Wisconsin, they opened the season against, I believe it was Illinois. I think that was like a Friday night game. And they just pasted them, man. They threw them right into a wood chipper. And then that was it. Because then COVID hits Wisconsin really hard, and they never got their team back. And specifically at the wide receiver position, they really never got their team back. So you're watching them in a standalone game, as we call it in our business. It's the only game on. Everyone's watching it. It's opening week, and Graham Mertz and Wisconsin had about the most flawless half of football offensively that you've seen Wisconsin have in a long time. And so everybody was talking about it. Everyone was excited, and then it's just like this preview, and then the tickets to the movie, well, all right, never mind, they're sold out. So no one gets to see what we thought we were going to see. COVID and injuries really took away what I thought could have been a top 10 caliber team this past year. Now, they have coming back and infused into their roster the two best recruiting classes they've had in a long time up there, specifically under Paul Chryst. Okay, that's the bedrock. That's the foundation right now of this roster. Jim Leonard, defensive coordinator there, had an offer to be the Green Bay Packers defensive coordinator. Okay, there's really nothing hidden here. It wasn't just like a cotton candy floated out there. It's not reality. Dude turned down Green Bay for Wisconsin. And so that's not a small thing. That's not a small thing at all. They got a really good roster. Quarterback is probably more stable than we've seen at Wisconsin in quite a while. And when I say stable, I don't mean just knowing who's going to be there. I'm talking about probably a little higher physical ceiling and potential, offensive potential. And listen, the skill spot last year, man, like they were not bad at wide receiver, but then they didn't have those guys on the field for either injury or COVID-related reasons. Remember, they handled it differently in the Big Ten than they did maybe in the SEC or the ACC. So keep an eye on Wisconsin. Aside from the obvious reasons, it's always a nice little solid program, but they've made some staff changes, changing the way they handle coaching in the secondary, for example. Just some tinkering going on there. I think Paul Chryst knows they're probably under the radar, and he wants me to shut up right now because he wants to keep it that way, so I will. Lastly, the USC Trojans. Now, this is a different one. This is sort of the inverse. Take the hourglass, turn it upside down, because USC, can you remember what your expectations were for them? I know the Trojans fans out there can. When we're entering 2020, keep in mind it seems like it's been a decade now that we've entered every season with Clay Helton on the hot seat, right? And so then they enter, and they're not really, blowing folks out, but they just keep winning games. And every game that they win, it's like you feel like you come out of it and you say, oh, they might as well have lost that game. Well, that's not really the way record keeping works in this sport or any other. However, with the way the Pac-12 schedule was structured, you got into the quarter pole of the season, what would be normally the quarter pole of the season. Well, the season's almost over by that point. And so I remember a couple of times sitting at this desk, Director Colin had to catch me because I was saying, you know, down the stretch, if USC doesn't get better, and it's like, man, they got one game left on the regular season. And so I think they went 5-1. They played in the Pac-12 championship game. And the conference did them no favors in handling that entire week leading up. But hey, Larry Scott era, rest in peace. There's a potential reversal here, though, because you see, what 2020 could have potentially done is just bought Clay Helton a year's worth of time that otherwise a regular season wouldn't have bought him. Well, now recruiting looks really good. Recruiting had fallen off a cliff. They finished like lower than 50th, and it was inexplicable at the time. But then they are top 10 in this current class, the 2021 class, and they landed the #1 player in the country per the 24/7 Sports Composite. And so, like, things look good all of a sudden. And they're going to enter the season, and some people have them ranked inside their top 15, and it's like, what are we supposed to think about USC? And so last year, I don't necessarily know if it fooled us on USC as much as it kind of bought Clay Helton maybe a year that otherwise he wouldn't have gotten. So, you know, I'm higher on Penn State, it seems, than the general public is right now. Maybe a little higher on LSU than the general public, because that's a tough taste to get out of your mouth, how bad they were last year. Wisconsin, I think come preview season time, everyone will have Wisconsin comfortably in the top 15, maybe still a little bit low on them. But USC, man, that one's just a question to me. It's a total question to me, and I think it's a total question even to a lot of the folks who cover the program and a lot of the fan base out there.